Thank you guys for tuning in today and welcome back to another episode of The Source. I'm your host, Sam Raza. And today I'll be talking to Peter Kuznick about the significance of China's role in helping to re-establish diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Peter Kuznick is professor of history and the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University. He also co-authored a book with Hollywood film director and producer Oliver Stone called The Untold History of the United States. Peter Kuznick, thank you so much for your time today.
Happy to be with you, Zane.
Let us begin with a recent development surrounding China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. In an unexpected development on March 11, China brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which would re-establish diplomatic ties between the two countries. Iran and Saudi Arabia have been adversaries in the region, conducting various proxy wars in Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon. The United States was not involved in this peace process, despite being a dominant player in the region for decades. Before we examine this development, which I will get into the next question, could you please provide some context to Iran-Saudi relations under U.S. leadership?
Zane, as you say, Iran and Saudi Arabia have been bitter enemies for a long time. And we were just talking about Iraq before. And the thing about Saddam Hussein was he was an enemy of Iran. He was an enemy of Al-Qaeda, but the Americans are so ignorant that they didn't even appreciate that. George Bush didn't even know there was a difference between the Sunnis and the Shiites. And so if we look at the history in that region, Iran and Saudi Arabia have both been major players. And the United States, in different ways, try to cultivate them both. And that worked to some extent when the Shah was in power in Iran. But once the revolution occurred in 1979, because the Iranians had deep-seated resentments against the United States. The United States overthrew their popular elected president and premier, Mossadegh, in 1953 in the biggest CIA coup up to that point, when he tried to nationalize Iran's oil and replace him, this popular leader. According to the U.S. ambassador, Mossadegh had the support of close to 98% of the Iranian people. He was a hero throughout the Middle East, even the Arab states. He was the first Iranian to have a Doctor of Law degrees from a European university. He was Time Magazine Man of the Year, and the CIA overthrew him in 1953. So the Iranians had good reason to hate the United States. And so after 1979, you've got the Iranians on one side and the Saudis, who are America's main ally there, aside from Israel, on the U.S. side. And that goes back to World War II. It goes back to Roosevelt's meetings with the Saudi leaders and said, FDR says, Saudi oil will be ours. The Brits can have Iranian oil, and we'll divide the rest up between us. And so the U.S. had these ties to the Saudis that go way back to the 1930s. And throughout we supported these repressive Saudi governments, overthrew the ones we didn't like and supported the other ones for decades. And so, but the problem was that the Saudis were lined up against our other main ally in the region, Israel, for a long time. And so the U.S. was constantly trying to broker peaceful relations between the Arab states and Israel, but it wasn't, the Palestinian issue was a much bigger issue for a long time. Carter was able to get the Camp David agreements with Israel and Egypt, and that began the process of improving relations between the Arab states and Israel. And in recent years, the big issue for the Saudis and the Israelis has been Iran potentially developing a nuclear weapons program. The CIA reported two decades ago, that Iran had abandoned its nuclear weapons program in 2003. The Israelis didn't accept that, and the Saudis didn't accept that. And recently, after the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, they've then been increasing their stockpile of enriched uranium, and they've been enriching to a much higher degree. You've got to enrich over 90% to make it weapons grade. But the Iranians have been enriching some of that stockpile to 60%. And the reactors that they mothballed, they've also brought back online. So even though the Iranians have not indicated any interest yet in developing nuclear weapons, what the world knows is that the Iranian breakout time now to develop those weapons is much, much less. The U.S. used to say we want at least a year, so we have time to react. Now it looks like it might be 3 months. Doesn't mean they can weaponize it. Doesn't mean they can put it on missiles and attack with it. But it means they're developing that capability. Israel over the years has sabotaged the Iran program. They've sabotaged it with various intelligence operations. They've sabotaged it by assassinating Iranian nuclear physicists. Various things that they've done to sabotage it, sometimes with support of the U.S. in terms of cyber warfare also. But as long as they had Saudi Arabia, and they've improved relations with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and some of the other Arab nations. And so when they had Saudi Arabia on their side, Israel felt much more empowered to attack Iran and attempt to destroy their facilities. We know that they've hardened those facilities. We know that they've dug them deeper underground. It's not completely clear that the Israelis even could destroy the Iranian nuclear facilities without the United States. One of our friend Cy Hersh, who's been in the news recently for his reporting about the U.S. destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. Cy exposed years ago U.S. plans to use nuclear weapons against Iran in order to destroy that. So it might require that. We don't know. Or I don't know if they could pull it off with conventional weapons, bunker buster bombs and other bombs of that sort. But the Israelis are clearly concerned and thinking in those terms. So now, the Iran-Saudi Arabia deal that was brokered by the Chinese seems to pull the rug out from under the Israelis by complicating the relationship, Saudi Arabia's role in that, because under current situation, it doesn't look like the Saudis would in any way support an Israeli attack against Iran.
According to reports from today, China's planning to take a step further and host an unprecedented summit attended by senior officials from Iran and its 6 neighbors of the Gulf Cooperation Council. The summit will take place in Beijing later this year. Could you talk about the significance of China's new role on the global stage?
China has been arguing for a long time that U.S. hegemony and unipolarity are outdated. China talks about win-win diplomacy, peaceful coexistence, multilateralism. We're saying we need a multipolar world. And they've also been saying that the United States is past its prime, that the United States is on the downturn, and that there's going to be a new global architecture, and China should play that role. But they've been laying low. I mean, they've been trying to not be too aggressive and out there and establish themselves. But their economy has certainly jumped by leaps and bounds in recent years. They're now the number two economy in the world. In many respects, they're becoming the number one economy and quickly in the world. And they see their diplomatic role as being commensurate with their economic power. And so, as they see the U.S. declining, and the U.S. they see as this kind of militaristic power with 800 bases around the world, but not a lot behind its militarism. China now has begun to assert itself in new ways. We saw some of this beginning with because you go back, it was during the during the Obama administration that Hillary Clinton announces a November 2011 article in Foreign Policy magazine titled America's Pacific Century. America's Pacific Century, meaning we're going to get out of the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Oil is not so relevant anymore. We're going to now focus on Asia and China especially. Our new goal is to contain China. And so but if you go back to that administration, who were the principals behind Obama and Clinton's Asia pivot? It was the Jake Sullivans. It was the people who are now advisors to Biden. Okay, so this begins under Obama. It gains momentum under that idiot Trump, who declares a trade war with China much more aggressively than Obama had, and makes it clear that China is our enemy. But he didn't know how to organize a foreign policy really to support that. But Biden comes in there surrounded by 18 top advisors from the Center for New American Security. This is Ratner. This is all the old Campbell, all the old China hawks who influenced Obama and Clinton are now running the show. And they double down on the sanctions toward China, the trade war with China. They intensify it. They say the high-tech goods, especially the ones that have military implications, cannot be sold to China. They increase sanctions, trade wars, but they also increase their diplomacy. So not diplomacy, their military presence. So they put more aircraft carriers in the Pacific. They tighten ties with South Korea, especially after the right-wing anti-China Yoon government wins election. Moon Jae-in was progressive and wanted friendly relations with China and South Korea, China and North Korea, but the Yoon government is much more aggressive. Along with the United States, they increase the number of military exercises, decapitation drills. The North Koreans freak out. They had a record number of missile launches last year. And just today, it's being reported in response to the latest U.S.-South Korean war games, the Chinese launched more missiles. So that situation is very, very dangerous. Then the other meeting that's going on today is with Britain and Australia. So you've got Sunak and you've got Albanese, the Australian premier, meeting with Biden in California today to talk about the AUKUS deal, the nuclear submarine sales to Australia. And so Australia is being roped in, but Biden has done this much more effectively than Trump and much more aggressively than Obama. Obama, at least maybe in some quarter of his brain, took seriously being a Nobel Peace Prize winner and would not supply lethal aid to Ukraine and was not as aggressive militarily toward China. But Biden is. And this Biden administration is as hawkish as they come. And so freedom of navigation operations, more aid to Taiwan, Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, more diplomacy with Taiwan. Uh, they're doing everything they can to provoke China at this point. And so, how is China responding? Initially, they responded with what we call the Wolff warrior diplomacy. When China's two top foreign policy officials met in Anchorage with Sullivan and Blinken, they rewrote the script. And instead of listening to the Americans' attacks on on the treatment of the Uyghurs and their aggressive policies in the South China Sea and their lack of human rights, the usual American denunciations of China, many of which I agree with, but they turned the table and went into an 18-minute harangue against the U.S. Say, who the F for you to talk to us with the voice of a hegemon like that, as if you're morally superior? You who invade all over the world, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and so that was the beginning with really evident change. And then Xi Jinping last year in October at the party announces that he's going to remain the party leader for another 5 years. We just finished the national uh, political Congress meetings in Beijing, and which has been now named president for another 5 years. That's more ceremonial. The important one was the party leadership role back in October. And what we've seen recently is, first of all, on February 20th, China releases a new paper titled U.S. Hegemony and Its Perils. On February 21st, China releases its new global security initiative. On February 24th, it releases its peace plan for Ukraine, which the United States, dismisses. And even Zelensky was much more open to it than the United States was. But the U.S. and NATO, Stoltenberg and the others say, oh, how China can't negotiate on Ukraine. They haven't even denounced the Russian invasion. China, said that the United States created preconditions that that triggered the Russian invasion. So, but what they said in their peace plan is very interesting. 12 points there. They said immediate ceasefire, or as soon as we can, and negotiate. But point one, reaffirm their commitment to sovereignty, effectively criticizing the Russian invasion as a breach of sovereignty. But number two said, no nation's security should be achieved at the expense of other nations' security. No military blocs should expand at the security interests of other countries. So they're also denouncing U.S. and NATO. And so it's a much more even-handed kind of approach, which in some ways should be the starting point for these negotiations. It was vague. There were a lot of, grounds for criticizing it, but it was not meant as a specific, game plan. It was meant as a broad statement of principle. And then out of the blue, they pull off this diplomatic coup with Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Middle East was always America's. The United States has been the dominant player in the Middle East since before World War II, and certainly since Carter in 1979. The U.S. has been totally the dominant player. And the fact that it was China who finally brought these adversaries together as part of its new, if you saw Xi Jinping's speech today, ending the party Congress, his speech was very much that China is now back as the world's diplomatic leader. And they're building upon the Belt and Road Initiative, which is very crucial in the Middle East. China is Saudi Arabia's leading trade partner. China is going to invest $500 billion in Iran. China is developing economic ties to these countries. at a time when the U.S. interest in that region is waning, U.S. influence is waning. Israel is increasingly isolated because they've got this fascistic government there that even Israel supporters are horrified by. They're doing away with the judicial independence and horrible things, and very, very extreme right wingers. It's shameful that Israel would tolerate such reactionary government. And so in this context, what China is doing is not only timely, but it really is undermining U.S. claims to being the world's hegemonic power. The other thing that we need to mention, and so we had the Qin Gang, the new foreign minister, talked about the containment, encirclement, and suppression of China by the United States. Those were the words he used. And they keep on warning that if U.S. policy is to try to contain or defeat China, then we're headed for war. But it's not only the Chinese who are saying that in ways that the Chinese have not said before, and naming the United States explicitly by name, which they have always avoided. Now the United States is doing the same thing. So not only are we building up Taiwan, but we've got four-star General Michael Minihan, a top U.S. general in the region, saying that the U.S. and China are going to be at war, he thinks, by 2025. He was explicit about it, 2025. Michael McCall, the Republican chair of the House Armed Services Committee, said, well, I hope he's wrong, but I don't think he is. And then we just have these new committees on China. And again, they're saying China poses an existential threat to the United States. So all the warmongers are coming out of the woodwork. And they're focused. Rand just issued a report titled Avoiding a Long War, which said that Iraq is not America's priority, that the United States should not get bogged down, not Iraq, Ukraine, excuse me, that the United States should not get bogged down in a war in Ukraine. They said by doing so, this distracts us from what our real priority is, and that is China. And a couple other things have come out recently. One is that the United States is way behind on its deliveries of weapons to Taiwan. 4 years behind, according to some estimates, tens of billions of dollars behind, because so much is going to Ukraine. And so if the U.S., if as we say, the U.S. priority, and we've been saying this for years now, that the pacing threat is China, and that's what we need to focus on. But Ukraine is a distraction. And so there's a loud voice developing for the U.S. to try to find an off-ramp through diplomacy sooner rather than later, especially now that Russia's on the offensive, doing a little bit better militarily, that the U.S. can't deliver, and that most of these new weapon systems won't be into Ukraine for months, if not longer, and the U.S. Abrams maybe not for years. They're saying that we're losing sight of our real priority. And so the Brits now are focusing again on Taiwan. They just announced today new large weapon sales to Taiwan as part of their overall military buildup. The United States, more weapon sales to Taiwan and more training, make Taiwan indigestible, the porcupine strategy. The U.S., four new bases in the Philippines, new war games going on today with the Philippines. Look at this around the region. China getting new diplomatic security agreements with the Solomon Islands. The U.S. freaks out about that. So you see everything that's going on, and you see the United States at the same time that the U.S. fears that its window for defeating China over Taiwan is closing. The CSIS issued a report saying that they did their own war game and the U.S. could defeat China over Taiwan. But the Pentagon has done 18 war games and China's won all of them. But the CSIS is saying that the window is closing. And we see that happening. The Yoon government in South Korea is very, very unpopular. A new government in Vietnam, that's what I can see, more friendly toward China. Uh, the Philippines cozying up again toward the United States. Uh, but Japan doubling its defense spending. There's a lot of signs that the Japanese public is not happy about that and getting rid of Article 9. But the world is becoming polarized along Cold War lines. And the U.S. is the main force behind that. NATO even says that is shifting priorities, not abandoning Europe, but expanding to include China as well. What is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization doing in the Pacific? I don't know. But, the warmongers are out, and it's a very, very dangerous situation. The world now, even compared to February 23rd, 2022, is so much more dangerous. We're sitting on a powder keg. And so many of these scenarios really require nuclear weapons. The Taiwanese are saying now that they're preparing. They know that what China would do if they try to if Taiwan declares independence, or if the U.S. continues pushing them in that direction, and the current vice president, who looks like he's going to become the next president, was an early advocate of Taiwanese independence. They say China's strategy is going to be a blockade. How are we going to defeat that blockade? They're all worried about this. And so these massive sales are just heightening the tensions on both sides. And so we're sitting on a powder keg, and we're closer to World War III and closer to nuclear war than we've maybe ever been, certainly since '62. And are we taking it seriously? Not seriously enough. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said a couple weeks ago, when the U.S. started warning about China-Russia ties, he says, the U.S. is the number one warmonger in the world. The U.S. accounted for about 80% of all post-World War II armed conflicts. The U.S. is also the number one violator of sovereignty and interferer in the internal affairs of other countries. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. has sought to subvert more than 50 foreign governments, grossly interfered in elections in at least 30 countries, and attempted assassinations on over 50 foreign leaders. The U.S. is also the number one source of antagonism and bloc confrontation. Chinese didn't talk like that before, but now they are feeling emboldened, dramatically increasing their nuclear capabilities as well as their overall military capabilities. Biggest navy in the world already, and this is the world that we've created. And it's terrible to see the world going in this direction when we've got so many real needs that the US and China and Russia and India and Saudis and Iranians should be working together on. And those are not getting worked on as we move toward polarization, new Cold War, and the possibility of a new hot war.
Peter Kuznick, author and professor of history, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Zane.
And thank you guys for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe to our alternative channels on Rumble and Telegram. YouTube can censor or shadow ban us at any time. So if you want to receive our information in the future, be sure to join our channels on Rumble and Telegram. And don't forget to donate. Please take into account that there's an entire team working behind the scenes, from camera, audio, light, and in the case of our German videos, translating, voiceover, video editing. So if you want us to continue providing you with independent and non-profit news and analysis, be sure to donate via PayPal, Better Place, or bank account. I'm your host, Zan Raza. See you guys next time.